If you can't tell by the thumbnail, I'd actually argue that this game should be called Coco Bandicoot Sane Trilogy, because what kind of idiot do you gotta be to play as Crash when you can play as this cutie here? I mean, just look at her. Adorable. In fact, my biggest complaint with the Sane Trilogy is that they sometimes force you to play as Crash. Like, what's up with that, man? That's messed up. But anyway, yeah, I just played through the Crash Sane Trilogy, and for some context, let me just tell you what my past experience is with Crash. I did not grow up with a PlayStation. I didn't have any PlayStations, actually, for a very long time. The first PlayStation I ever had was a PS4, so I totally missed out on PS1, PS2, PS3, and, you know, lots of exclusives that came with that. So I never actually played the original Crash Bandicoot games as a kid or anything. I played some of the later Crash Bandicoots on, like, the GameCube, like Wrath of Cortex and stuff, but I didn't particularly love Crash too much. So the Sane Trilogy was really my first time, like, actually getting into Crash Bandicoot, and this is not my first time playing the Crash Sane Trilogy. I played it a couple years back, around the time that Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled came out, so I have absolutely no nostalgia for these games. When the Sane Trilogy first came out, I saw people all talking about, oh, the nostalgia, blah, 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 whatever. But I don't have any of that. I just look at the Crash Bandicoot games as games. And doing that, I think they're absolutely awesome. And there's two reasons I'm coming back to the Sane Trilogy now. One is that I want to play Crash 4, so I just felt like playing through these games again as a little bit of prep for it, but also because when I first played the Sane Trilogy, I just basically played through the base game and didn't do anything more than that. I just, you know, reached the credits, beat Cortex, and called it a day there. I didn't collect all the gems or all the extra stuff you can do in these games the first time around, so I wanted to give that a shot and see how it was. But before I talk about that, I should just talk about the games themselves and how they play. So first, let me do a quick mechanic breakdown to get you up to speed with how Crash works in case you've never played any of these games before. In Crash Bandicoot, you can run, you can jump, and you can spin. That's it. That's the entire mechanic breakdown. That's all you can do in the game. And normally, actually, games this simple aren't really that much of my thing. Generally, I like games that are a little bit more complex and interesting. You know, more mechanics, more moves, more ways to maneuver my character in the case of a platformer. But Crash 1 is as simple as it can be. It's pretty much just Donkey Kong Country, but in 3D. Unlike most 3D platformers that have more wider open areas that kind of take more advantage of the 3D space, Crash Bandicoot is very much like hallway-style level design, where like you just take a 2D platformer and you just turn it 90 degrees, so now instead of running left to right, you're now running forward into the distance, and then you just add a little bit of width to that, and then that's how you get to this style of 3D platformer. Very unique, and obviously came about due to the limitations of the original PlayStation, but it results in a pretty good 3D precision platformer. Though I must say, precision platformers also are not really my thing most of the time. Games like Super Meat Boy and stuff like that, I've played them, I've tried them before, but they just never really did it for me for whatever reason. Even something like Celeste, I didn't really particularly care for that much. But for whatever reason, I find myself really liking Crash. Maybe it's just because it's a 3D platformer, and I just inherently like 3D platformers more than 2D ones. But whatever the reason is, I really enjoy the Crash Bandicoot games, and in particular, I really like Crash 1. It's actually my favorite of the trilogy, which I feel like probably puts me in a minority, because generally when I hear people talking about Crash 1, all they talk about is how hard it is, and how frustrating they find it, but personally, I really don't find Crash 1 to be very frustrating at all. And speaking of the game's difficulty, you remember that stupid thing from when the Sane Trilogy first came out where everyone was comparing it to Dark Souls? Well, actually, I honestly feel that's a pretty apt comparison because, like Dark Souls, Crash is a game that is challenging, but it's not like super duper ultra difficult or anything. I've certainly played games that are much harder than both Crash and Dark Souls. Like personally, the Stormy Ascent level, the level that they took out of the original game and then added back into the Sane Trilogy as DLC, I don't know why they cut that out of the game. Like, the level isn't really that much more difficult than any of the other levels in the game. It's just longer than the other ones. I really don't have any issues with that level whatsoever. In fact, let me tell you a story about the first time I played Crash 1, because it's pretty funny, I think. Because I was familiar with these bridge levels here. I had heard stories about the last bridge level of the game and how it's like super duper insanely hard and stuff. And while I was playing through Crash 1, I was like, the game's not that hard, really. Like, what's everyone worried about? And then I got to the first bridge level, and I was like, okay, you know, whatever. Just like every other level in the game. Difficult, but not too bad or anything. Let's see how this ramps up for that final bridge level. Let's see what it's all about. So then I got to the second bridge level, and it was quite a step up in difficulty. Definitely a lot more challenging than the first one, but still not, like, insanely difficult to me. But I was like, okay, yeah, that's actually getting pretty real now. I'm definitely looking forward to see what this final bridge level is like. And then I beat the game, and I was like, wait, there's only 2 bridge levels? That was the super hard level that everybody was talking about? Are you fucking kidding me, bro? Like, yeah, it was tough, and I died a lot on the level, but that's what everybody was talking about? Maybe I just have a different perspective on what I consider to be difficult in a game. If I die like 20 times on something, I don't really consider that difficult, honestly. Difficult to me is something that I get like stuck on and I cannot beat it for an extended period of time. Like, it's gotta take me at least like a half hour or something like that for me to actually call a challenge difficult in a game. But the Road to Nowhere, I think it's called, is certainly nothing like that. And is this just me bragging about how good I am at video games? Yeah, partially. You know, most 3D platformers are pretty dang easy. There's very few of them that actually attempt to be, like, challenging, difficult games to play. Which is fine, not every game needs to be super hard, but as someone that does enjoy difficult games, it's really fun to get a 3D platformer that is really challenging. And in the case of Crash, it all comes down to the level design. I think this game has awesome level design. I think it's really, really good. Because it's challenging, but it's always in such a way where you know exactly what you need to do, and it's just about having the skill and precision in order to do it. Though it's not just that the game is difficult, it's also that the level design really takes full advantage of what you're capable of in this game. So many 3D platformers have very wide movesets where you have all these different things that you can do, but they never really ask you to use a lot of that moveset very much. I personally find that very few 3D platformers really take full advantage of what you're capable of doing in the game and really push the mechanics to their absolute limit to make really interesting and fun gameplay. And Crash 1, despite having basically no mechanics, being such an incredibly simple game, it takes these very simple mechanics and fleshes them out as much as possible. Crash 1 is a game that does not fuck around. Like, this game, you have to really be on the ball all the time with everything you do. Like, when you're jumping off platforms, you have to try to make sure you jump at the very last possible second to extend your jump as far as possible. The timing on cycle-based things like moving platforms and hazards is actually really tight, and a lot of times they can be very devious. Like, these are genuine traps a lot of the time, meant to actually catch the player if they're not paying attention. A lot of the platforms that you have to jump on are much tinier than what you're going to see in a lot of other 3D platformers, so you have to really be precise in controlling yourself and making sure that you land exactly where you want to without making any mistakes, all while having to avoid a bunch of enemies and obstacles at the same time. This game is extremely relentless with its difficulty. Like, it doesn't, like, say, good job, you did it, now here's a little bit of a cooldown. It's just like, no, you did that challenge, okay, so here's the next one, and the next one, and the next one. It never gives you a breather, it never gives you a break, it's just constantly throwing genuinely challenging things at you, and you have to deal with it. It uses the limited design of what Crash 1 is to challenge the player in as many ways as it can, and I think it results in a really fun game. The design of the game is just so insanely tight. There's no way to BS your way through Crash Bandicoot. The only way you're going to get through these platforming sequences and clear out these levels is to actually get good enough at the game to get through these sequences without making many mistakes. I actually really like how the game uses a one-hit and you're dead kind of design, because it means in most cases you're not really going to be able to use extra hit points in order to just tank through stuff that you can't complete. Obviously there are the masks, and so you can do that to a degree, but only so much. Generally, most of the time you're going maskless in Crash Bandicoot, which means you're just going to have to get through these levels without making very many mistakes. And while a challenging thing to ask the player, it's entirely doable because the level design in the game is completely fair at all times. For the most part, there are a couple of instances during certain boss fights that I did find that was complete horseshit, but, you know, it's an old game, so there are gonna be some problems here and there, but generally, overall, the game is very well designed in my opinion. One thing I'm not in love with is the game's, like, assisting system that it does, where when you die enough times at a single checkpoint, it'll just spawn you with a mask. I'm totally down for this as a system to help players that are struggling through sequences, but personally, just because I'm having trouble with something and it's difficult and I'm taking many tries to do it, that doesn't mean that I want help. I know for a lot of people, they can get frustrated being stuck on something for a while and having to do it over and over, but personally, I'm totally okay with smashing my head against a difficult challenge in a game until I beat it, so long as what I'm doing is fun, which is absolutely the case in Crash. So I don't really have a problem with this system being here for players that want the help. I just wish there was a way to disable this so I could play through the game without, you know, quote-unquote cheating some of the platforming sequences that I'm having trouble with. Not really a huge complaint or anything, and, you know, honestly, sometimes with some of the things in these games, I actually am grateful for these masks sometimes, because some of this fucking shit is like, bro, what the fuck? Honestly, I really don't even have very many major complaints about Crash 1. Like, I guess the game does use limited lives, but personally, I have never game overed in Crash 1, ever, in both of the playthroughs that I've done of it. The game showers you with lives. Like, yeah, you die a lot because it's difficult, but you get so many lives that I honestly find it difficult to ever imagine running out. But, you know, some people do. Some people have more trouble with this game than me. So, yeah, lives are still a dumb thing that are here because it's an old game and they thought lives were good back then. I guess one real complaint I have for Crash is that the boss fights are pretty inconsistent. Like, some of them are okay, but some of them are pretty fucking pathetic, actually. In general, the bosses are not very difficult for such a challenging game, but they're okay, so I'm not too bothered by them. You know what's another thing I like about Crash 1? This is a motherfucking platformer and nothing else. There's no alternative gameplay, there's no stupid mini-games, there's no bullshit like that. This is just a game that is pure 100% Crash 3D platforming the entire time, and it doesn't do anything but that. There are a couple of auto-scrolling levels here and there, but those definitely still fall squarely into what I would call 3D platforming, and they're still very fun. But there's no vehicle sections, there's no turret sequences, there's no other crap like that a lot of other platformers shove into them for some reason. This is an extremely focused game where it has its gameplay, and that's what you play when you play this game, which is something I definitely like. I prefer games that are more focused and don't deviate from what they are in order to do a bunch of crap that's not as good as the core gameplay, and sometimes deviates entirely into like different genres and shit, which you're like, why are we doing a shooting section now in a platformer? I don't want to do this. Now, as for getting all of the gems, which is something I've not done previously in Crash Bandicoot, I actually found the process to be pretty enjoyable for the most part, which the reason I didn't do it when I first played through these games is because I just kind of assumed that it would probably be a miserable experience that kind of sucked, because generally I don't really like collectibles in linear games, and so the idea of having to get every single box in a level, it just sounded like a really annoying experience to me, where I'd end up completing a level, but I'd be missing like 1 or 2 boxes, and I'd have no idea where it is, and then I have to play the level over and over in order to find where the boxes are, and it would just be really tedious and annoying. But actually, to my surprise, it's not really that much of a problem, because generally they don't really hide the boxes most of the time. For the most part, almost all of the boxes are just kind of there in plain sight. You just have to go out of your way to get them. Some of them require going out of your way to do an extra difficult platforming sequence or something like that, but that's totally fine. I wasn't worried about that. What I was worried about was having to hunt for boxes, you know, checking every single nook and cranny to make sure I don't miss any, and there are a couple of boxes in some levels that they do actually hide them from you, and you have to search for them a little bit, and yeah, there were a couple of levels where I would complete the level and be missing one box and not know where it is, and I have to go back and search around for boxes that are hidden just slightly off camera or something like that. And that was a little bit annoying, but it's not too common. Most of the time, as long as you just go out of your way to get all the boxes, you're gonna get all the boxes. Getting the color gems was slightly annoying because they make you collect all of the boxes and complete the level without dying, which to my understanding they also made you do that in the original Crash for all of the gems, which it wasn't like a miserable experience or anything, but it was kind of just a bit boring to just be playing the level so many times in order to complete it without dying. It's just like, not my favorite thing in the world, but not too terrible. And actually, I'm really glad that I came back to this game to do all the gems and stuff, because all those gem paths that you can do, I totally ended up missing my first time through the game. And there's just like extra levels here that you can play that you don't play if you only try to just beat the game without getting all the gems. Like, all these gem paths are just as good as every other part of the game, and it's just like more Crash 1 levels that I get to play. Like, hell yeah, dude, this is awesome. I had no idea that doing the gem paths would give me stuff like this to do. Like, had I known that, I probably would have done this right away. This is a really good way to incentivize the player to go for 100% or whatever, because if you tell me I have more game to play in a game this fun, absolutely I want to do that. I guess now the only thing left to talk about in terms of Crash 1 would be the time trials. And what might be surprising to hear for some of my fans is I actually did not like these at all. Two reasons for that. Number one is that this is a pretty challenging game, and so just completing the level without dying already is inherently something that has a pretty small margin of error compared to something like a Sonic game would. In those games, completing a level is pretty easy most of the time, so you have a lot of room for improvement to improve your time when you're trying to go for speed. But here in Crash, there's not really that much you can do once you've completed the level without dying. Because the game is so mechanically simple, playing for speed and just playing normally isn't really any different. Pretty much the only difference is that you don't make any mistakes and you do it all in one sequence. Which can be gratifying in its own way for some people, for sure, but personally, I'm not really into that kind of thing. I enjoy time attacking in like Sonic games because the gameplay of playing those games as quickly as possible is inherently fun to me, whereas the gameplay of playing Crash as quickly as possible is basically the exact same as playing the game normally. It's something that if I wanted to dedicate the time to it, I probably could get all the Platinum Relics, but honestly, I just wasn't feeling like doing that, so I just didn't. I got the first couple of them, and then I got to this level here, and the collision on these enemies with the shields is a little bit inconsistent. Like, sometimes you don't bounce off of them, you start, like, walking on them and stuff. And that inconsistent behavior ended up killing me a lot of times, and I was like, Jesus fucking Christ, I'm not gonna put up with this bullshit when I'm trying to get good runs in this game, and the game itself is just failing on me. I put up with this crap enough in Sonic games. So yeah, that's Crash 1. Fantastic game. Absolutely love it. On to Crash 2, which I believe is generally the fan-favorite Crash game of the trilogy. Though personally, I find this to be quite a significant step down from Crash 1. I still like Crash 2 a lot. I still think it's a really fun game. But it has basically thrown away the things that I enjoyed most about Crash 1, which was 1, its incredibly tight level design, and 2, the difficulty. Crash 2 is so much fucking easier than Crash 1. Way, way, way easier. Like, shockingly so. I'd be surprised if I died even a tenth as much as I did in Crash 1 when playing through Crash 2. There are a couple of sequences in Crash 2 that get to be challenging, some of the gem paths and death paths and stuff like that, but those are for this game like the super difficult extra challenges you can go for, and they just barely start to approach the difficulty of normal levels in Crash 1. The level design that they've created here is just so much easier than what they had in the previous game. But the big reason that Crash 2 is so easy compared to Crash 1 is because of the new moves they've added to the game. Because now you have this slide that you can do, and you can jump out of the slide in order to get a high jump effect, and you can slide off of ledges in order to jump mid-air, Donkey Kong Country style. And so this slide jump really changes the way that Crash 2's level design works, because in Crash 1, there was no way to cheat your way around the level design. When there were platforming challenges, you had to complete them, full stop. There was no way around it. But here in Crash 2, holy shit, you can skip so much stuff by just slide jumping around everything. So many platforms and stuff you can just completely ignore, and gaps that you can just completely make irrelevant by slide jumping. The high jump allows you to get up to areas that you're not normally supposed to be able to, and actually, I figured something out on my first playthrough of the Sane Trilogy that I think is a bug specific to the Sane Trilogy that wasn't in the original games, which is that if you do a slide jump and then spin at the same time as you jump, for whatever reason, you jump even higher than you do normally. You can see it very clearly in this example here, where I do a normal slide jump, and then I do a spinning slide jump, and look at how much higher you go. This enables you to totally fuck with the game's level design in very clearly unintended ways, where like you have sequences like this, where there's these like ostrich things that you step on them and then they lower themselves, and if you don't jump off of the ostriches here, you can't get up to this higher platform to get the boxes. You can clearly see that they measured this exactly to make sure that a high jump is not enough to get up here. But now you can just use a spinning high jump and make it up there anyway, meaning you don't have to actually do this platforming challenge correctly. And on top of that, an even higher jump also means an even further jump, because you can slide off of a ledge and then do the spinning high jump and get even more distance, making it so you can skip even more of the level design than you're supposed to be able to with the high jump as intended. Like, you have these sequences here in some of the first levels of the game where you go into this pit and you have to fight a bunch of enemies in order to get your way out. But actually, you can just do a slide jump and just fly right over the pit, or if you still fall in anyway, a spinning high jump is enough that you can just jump straight out of the pit without having to make the bouncy platform appear. And this just totally fucks with the level design of this game compared to Crash 1. Like I said, that game was extremely tight. You had to do everything that you had to do. There was no getting around it, there was no cheating, there was no cheap way of completing the levels. But now in Crash 2, there are so many things that you don't even really have to interact with when you're going through these levels. And normally I actually like games that let you do stuff like this, where you can kind of cheat the level design using the mechanics in more advanced ways. But in the case of Crash 2, this actually doesn't really work for me because it makes the game less fun to play. Because there's still nothing actually very interesting about doing these slide jumps and stuff. It's still very simple and basic. It just basically means that you can jump way further and higher than you normally would be able to, and way more than it seems like the level design is designed for in most cases. You see so much platforming in this game where it's designed for just like standard jumps, like this is Crash 1, and you can basically just ignore this. This game now has the exact problem that I was praising Crash 1 for not having, where most 3D platformers give you all of these different ways you can maneuver your character, but they never actually push those mechanics very far. They never ask you to use them in a way that is actually interesting and challenging. Crash 1 did not have that problem. It took its very simple mechanics and really stretched them as far as they could to make fun level design. Crash 2 gives you this insanely powerful new ability, and then it doesn't really account for it almost at all with the level design. And so it, for me, makes Crash 2 a significantly less fun game than Crash 1 is. It's still a really fun platformer, I still like it a lot, but holy shit, dude, the two strongest things that were in Crash 1 are now gone. The only part of Crash 2 that I actually found, like, really challenging was this one death path in this snow level here. But this I actually found difficult in, like, a bad kind of way, where I found it challenging because it's kind of not the best designed in the world, in my opinion, because the ice physics in this game are completely fucked, if you ask me. It's not like, ice physics, they make you slide around and so it's more difficult. Like, no. The actual way that, like, the inertia and momentum works, it is very, very fucked up. It does not work in any way that makes any logical sense. I'm going to assume that this is how it worked in the original game, and so the Sane Trilogy is just replicating that, but if that's the case, then the ice physics were fucked up in the original game, too. One of the other things I found really annoying about this sequence is I ran into, like, a control issue in this game that I really do not like, which is that when you hit the ground, you're normally able to do whatever you want immediately. You know, you can jump or slide or spin the very frame that you're on the ground, if you're moving. However, if you hit the ground and you're at a standstill, then your character does this, like, landing animation, and for whatever reason, you're not allowed to slide during this animation. You can do anything else, you can move or jump or spin, that's fine, but you're just specifically not allowed to slide until you start moving or this animation ends. What the fuck is the point of that? That was really fucking annoying and killed me a number of times. I will give Crash 2 this. I do think it has a much more fun experience in terms of going for all the gems, because now it has the death paths and stuff, and now for getting the color gems, you have to do, like, special, unique challenges for each of them. That's definitely a lot more enjoyable. Now, while I didn't like going for the relics in Crash 1, I figured Crash 2 plays so differently that it's probably worthwhile to try and get the relics in this game too, because it would probably offer a fairly different experience, and it definitely did. But not really in a way that makes it any better, in my opinion. I didn't like doing the time trials in Crash 1 because the game is really difficult and it's really no different than playing normally. And that latter point is still kind of true. Like, yeah, now the game necessitates you using a lot of slide jumps to skip stuff, but I was already doing that anyway, so it doesn't really make a difference. But it was definitely a lot easier to get the time trials in this game than it was in Crash 1, because the game is a lot easier, so completing the levels without dying was not nearly as difficult as it was in the first one. But also, the times in this game are way less strict than they were in Crash 1. Like, in Crash 1, when I would complete a level, I would usually end up getting a gold, and I'd have to do a couple more runs in order to shave off some extra time and get the platinum. But in Crash 2, I was getting platinum after platinum after platinum first try, without even dying on the level. The time trials in this game are now so easy to get, actually, that I just found it boring, so I didn't do it in this game either. Personally, I don't really think the Crash games are very good for time. I think they're better as just general 3D platformers. Really, the only major difference is that when you play the game initially, you don't have the running shoes, so the fastest way to move is to constantly slide and spin everywhere. But once you beat the game, you unlock the running shoes, so now you can just run around, which is much faster. But it's also easier and not as fun as repeatedly sliding and spinning all over, so So that's Crash 2. Don't like it as much as Crash 1, but still a very fun platformer. I still like it a lot. But now we move on to Crash 3, which is definitely my least favorite of the trilogy. Unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned, going with the original 3 Crash games, they kind of just get worse and worse over time. Because Crash 3 has the same problems that Crash 2 did, but I guess they decided that it wasn't bad enough in Crash 2, so they decided, let's make the game even more irrelevant and even easier. Because now, in Crash 3, every time you beat a boss, you unlock a new move, which sounds great on paper, except for what these moves actually do and how they affect the gameplay. Because there's 2 moves in particular you get that are completely fucked, which is the double jump and the tornado spin. Double jump is pretty self-explanatory, but the tornado spin, what it does is it lets you spin repeatedly, and if you do that in the air, then it will give you a slower descent when falling, kind of acting like a glide. And the fucked up thing about all these new moves is that you can combine everything together. So you can do a spinning slide jump into a double jump into a tornado spin, and this just lets you completely fucking break all of the level design in this game. Like, I talked about how in Crash 2 you can skip over a lot of shit, but Crash 3 is absolutely absurd. There are entire swaths of the level that you can just jump over like they don't even exist. And in general, I would also say that just inherently the level design of Crash 3 is even easier than the level design of Crash 2. Again, normally I would kind of be into this kind of stuff in a game. I generally like having complex movement mechanics that let you do really cool stuff that maybe is unintended, but these games just push it way too far in a way that's not really particularly fun. This doesn't make the platforming more interesting, it just makes it so you don't have to do most of it. And again, there's basically nothing in the game that is actually designed with this stuff in mind. But not only is the core gameplay, in my opinion, worse than it was in the previous two Crash games, but Crash 3 has now introduced another thing that is exactly what Crash 1 didn't do that I liked, which is that it's added a bunch of mini-games into the game, where now a bunch of the levels in the game are no longer traditional Crash platforming levels, and Crash 2 had some of this stuff as well, like there were a couple of jetpack sequences and things like that, but this game does it a lot more than Crash 2 did. However, in this case, I'm gonna say it's not that much of a problem because generally, for the most part, most of these alternate types of gameplay are actually pretty fun. Like, the Tiger auto-scrolling levels are fine, you know, they've had those in the previous games, I don't mind those very much. The motorcycle race levels are pretty fun, and I don't mind the water skiing levels, but they're not, like, super great. They're okay. But then you also have a couple of these plane levels, and they're just really boring and easy. These levels are done in like a matter of seconds. And then you have these swimming levels that I really, really don't like. They play absolutely terribly. The controls in these levels are so loose and floaty. Like, it's so weird for Crash, a series that is so about, like, ultra-precise, tight controls where you have 100% certainty that no matter what you do, it's always going to happen in the game one-to-one based on your inputs. And then you get into this swimming gameplay, and they throw that out the window, and you have, like, this weird inertia on your movement where it's really difficult to come to a complete stop, to wait for hazards to get out of your way and stuff. And changing your direction, you have like this weird turning arc, it just feels terrible. I absolutely hate these fucking levels. And as far as getting all the gems in Crash 3 goes, it's a fine enough experience. You know, it's fun getting all the boxes and all that. However, Crash 3 is the game where they actually introduced the time relics. That's something that they retroactively added to Crash 1 and 2 with the Sane Trilogy. So for the first two games, they're optional for like getting the true ending or whatever. But in Crash 3, they actually do make you do all of the relic challenges because you unlock 5 additional levels in the game by getting all the relics in the game of any rank, and you also get 1 extra gem for getting at least a gold relic on every single level. And to be honest, just like Crash 2, I found doing the time trials in this game so boring that I just didn't even bother to do it. I did play through all of the levels once doing time trials just to unlock those last 5 levels, just to play them. And they were fun levels, you know, they were like any other of the levels in the game, so they were good. But, yeah, not really a fan of how they force you to do the time trials in order to get the last gem in the game. That's pretty much all I have to say about Crash 3, which is, yeah, a bit of a downgrade from Crash 2, which is also, in my opinion, a downgrade from Crash 1. A bit unfortunate, in my opinion, that this series kind of just gets worse over time, but while I have been pretty negative about Crash 2 and 3, I do want to reiterate, I do still enjoy these games inherently as platformers. They still are really fun to just play. It's just that Crash 1, Crash 1 is just so good, and everything that made Crash 1 so good is just missing from Crash 2 and 3. They're still fun in their own ways, but it's a different way than what Crash 1 is fun like. And as far as the trilogy overall goes, I would say that these games are really, really good. Like I said, Crash is a game that I don't have any nostalgia for. I didn't play it as a kid, but I definitely did play a lot of games like this growing up. And I definitely do think that the types of games that I played as a kid has very heavily influenced my taste in games nowadays. Because an old school ass game like this is like everything that I want out of a video game. You know, a lot of games these days, they go for like the big cinematic story-focused thing. You know, immersion, photorealistic graphics, all that kind of stuff. And personally, games like that are just really not for me most of the time. It's very rare that I get into games like that. Like, people are like, oh, The Witcher 3 is like the greatest fucking video game ever. And like, it's just not a game for me. I tried it and I'm just like, no. I really am not someone that cares too much about like immersing myself in the experience of a game. I'm just someone who's here for fun gameplay most of the time. If a game has a good story, I'm all for that, but for me, a game is a game first and foremost, and the gameplay is what I care most about. I'm totally fine playing a game with absolutely no story as long as it's got good gameplay. And games like this that don't even really try to tell a story and are purely just video game-ass video games, this is the kind of shit that I really love. This is most of the types of games that I like to play. Personally, if you ask me, as far as Naughty Dog games go, I'll take a Crash Bandicoot over an Uncharted every single day of the week. And you know, while the Crash games don't really have anything like a story in particular, you know, they have a little bit of cutscenes here and there and whatever, but who actually cares? I will say I do really like the aesthetic and the setting and the characters of Crash Bandicoot. Like, all the bosses have a lot of personality and really fun character designs. The art style in general is just really fun. I like Neo Cortex as a villain. He's very goofy and enjoyable. These games to me are a really good example of like how a game doesn't need to have like this big epic story. Like, it can just be kind of the set dressing that you use to wrap this game around in, and that can work really well in a way that does still enhance the game and make it more enjoyable. Like, even with the tiny little bits of story that you get in these games, I find it very charming. Like, you know, the first game is as plain and straightforward as it gets. Cortex creates Crash, and then Crash ends up escaping, and now he's trying to save Tawna, who's going to get experimented on like Crash was about to. Bam, that's it. Video game, go. And then Crash 2, you get a lot more of Cortex, and he's a fun character. I just like listening to him talk and stuff, and that game also introduced Coco, and she's calling you a couple times, you know, trying to warn Crash and stuff like that. You know, they're attempting to put a little bit extra in there to make it more enjoyable, and I think it works well enough. And then Crash 3 introduces Entropy, and it has this whole time travel gimmick, and so all of the levels are themed around different times, and I think that's very fun. Although I do find it weird that Crash 3's whole thing is like time, and then Entropy is like a minor villain in the game. Like, he's only the third boss you fight. He's not even the second to last boss in the game. Like, it just seems weird that he's the one that enables the entire premise of the game, and at the beginning, they do make like a big deal of like, oh shit, they've recruited Entropy, and then he basically just is no more important than any of the other minor bosses. Crash 3 also does introduce Uka Uka, you know, the evil equivalent to Aku Aku, which I think is fun enough. Now both sides have their own magical mask helping them out. And of course the music in all these games is really, really good and really catchy, no complaints there. One thing I do find a little bit strange about all of these games is how they do, like, the placement of their level themes. Because they do it like Donkey Kong Country style, where they have like a bunch of different like level tile sets, quote unquote. But they don't do them like worlds, you know, like other games would have like, you know, using Crash 3 as an example, there's like the Middle Eastern themed levels, and there's like in the hub world, there's like the Middle Eastern themed like area where, you know, the level select here is clearly like doing the Middle Eastern theme. But then all the levels are just like randomly just thrown all over the place. Like, you don't do all of the Middle Eastern levels at once, and then you go on to the medieval levels, and then the China-themed levels. It's just all over the place. You do a China level, and then a dinosaur level, and then a far future level, and then a pirate level. Like, what the fuck is going on with these games? I guess it was probably to vary up the games, because if you did all of the levels of a singular theme in one go, then it would probably get very repetitive, because all the levels within one theme are designed very similarly because they are reusing a lot of the same assets. Like, continuing on the Crash 3 example, all of the Great Wall of China levels are you running along on the Tiger in an auto-scroller, so if you had the player do all of these levels in one go, then it would kind of be tiring. So I guess it makes sense in the way that they execute it, but I do find it pretty weird that these games don't do, like, worlds in that kind of way where all the themes are together, because it just makes it feel like you're not really, like, progressing, really. Like, I don't feel like I'm going anywhere when I'm playing Crash 1. The hub world shows you going across the different islands and stuff, but it just feels like levels just being thrown at me. It doesn't feel like I'm progressing anywhere. You know, you look at this level and you look at this level, and you can't really tell just by looking at them what's the beginning of the game and what's the end of the game. Not really a problem or anything, just something I do find to be kind of an odd choice. Oh yeah, another really minor thing that I like is I really love the sound of picking up Wumpa Fruit in this game. It is like the most satisfying, like, collectible pickup sound in like any platformer I've ever played. Minor thing, but I do really like it. Though I'm not in love with the fact that when you break open boxes, you have to actually like stand there for a second in order to collect the Wumpa Fruit. That kind of just slows down the pacing of the game. I would definitely prefer if you just automatically collected the fruit once you break the boxes, which does happen sometimes in some circumstances, but then other times it doesn't happen. It's very inconsistent and weird. I don't like it. And with that, I think that is all my thoughts on the Crash and Sane Trilogy. Fantastic game. 3 really good games. You know, ones that kind of get worse over time, but still really, really good. I really, really like this game a lot. And going for all the gems in the games was very fun, for the most part, with, you know, some minor things here and there that I didn't like. I'm very, very interested to see what Crash 4 is like, because, you know, it's made so much after the fact with such more advanced technology. You know, it doesn't have the same limitations that the original games did. Like, there is that one new level added into this game, Future Tense, which was created for the Insane Trilogy, and this level, I think, is really, really cool. It's a Crash 3 level, meaning you get all the fucked up bullshit you can do in Crash 3, but the level is actually designed with these abilities in mind, and it actually manages to be quite challenging. It actually feels very much in line with the type of difficulty that I would expect for Crash 1. So you definitely still can make good old-fashioned tough Crash levels, even with all these extra moves, so I'm hoping to see that kind of thing in Crash 4. You know, as a Sonic fan, I often hear people talking about the comparison of Mario 64 versus Sonic Adventure as far as, you know, the first crack at a 3D platformer on the, you know, generation of 3D consoles and all that. But Crash also gets that comparison too. You know, a lot of people pitting PlayStation against N64, which had the better 3D platformer, Mario 64 or Crash. So amongst that, like, 3-way battle, personally, as much as I do enjoy Mario 64 and Sonic Adventure, if you ask me, Crash is definitely by far the best of the 3. Anyway, thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.